Parents, when did you realize you'd raised a psychopath? Cade came home from school smiling from cheek to cheek. Mom, I think Catherine Novak finally likes me back, he said, bouncing on his seat. Tell me about it, I said. He explained how he'd been teasing her about her outfits in class and called her a beluga for eating lunch. He said she always reacted strongly, which meant she must like him. Today he'd hidden her backpack as a prank and she'd chased him down the hallway crying to get it back. It made me really uncomfortable. But Cade didn't have many friends and had never shown interest in girls before. I thought he just didn't understand how to properly express his feelings. Honey, I sat him down. You should try being a bit nicer. Girls like boys who are sweet to them. Cade rolled his eyes and said Catherine wasn't like other girls. She liked when he was tough and funny. He said she pretended to be upset, but really she enjoyed the attention. When I suggested he try complimenting her instead, he laughed and said I didn't understand his generation. Over the next few weeks, Cade came home with more stories about Catherine. He'd knocked her books off her desk accidentally and helped pick them up. He'd started calling her Messy Jessie because she spilled yogurt on herself once. He thought it was hilarious when she got red-faced and told him to stop. I tried talking to him, but he insisted this was just how kids flirted now. He said Catherine was playing hard to get, and he just needed to be persistent. One day, Cade came home upset because Catherine had partnered with someone else for a project. He'd assumed they'd worked together since he'd been giving her so much attention. When she chose another student, he'd made a joke about her being too stupid to recognize a good partner. She'd apparently gotten very quiet after that. Cade, that wasn't a joke, I said firmly. That was mean. You need to apologize. He argued that I didn't understand their dynamic. He said Catherine knew he was kidding and she probably partnered with someone else to make him jealous. I insisted he needed to be kinder, but he stormed off to his room saying I was ruining his chances with her. The next week, Cade's behavior escalated. He started leaving notes in Catherine's locker with funny comments about her appearance. He'd wait by her car after school to tease her about her driving. He even started a group chat where he'd share embarrassing photos of her he'd taken without her knowledge. When I found out about the photos, I was horrified. I made him delete everything and grounded him from his phone. But he said all the guys shared photos of girls they liked, and Catherine would think he didn't care about her if he stopped. I decided to call the school counselor for advice. Mrs. Nielsen listened to my concerns and said she'd look into the situation. 2 days later, I got a call asking me to come in for a meeting. When I arrived, the principal and counselor were there with a thick folder of complaints about Cade. Multiple teachers had reported Cade harassing Catherine. She'd asked to change classes to get away from him. Her grades were dropping, and she'd started eating lunch in the library to avoid him. What Cade called flirting, everyone else recognized as bullying. I sat there feeling sick. They suspended Cade for 3 days and required him to attend counseling. On the drive home, he sulked in the passenger seat, insisting everyone was overreacting. He said Catherine was just dramatic and trying to get attention. He couldn't understand why he was in trouble for showing interest in a girl. The suspension didn't change Cade's attitude. He blamed Catherine and said she'd ruined his reputation. He started telling people she was crazy and had made up lies about him. Even after counseling sessions, he maintained that he'd done nothing wrong and everyone else was too sensitive. One evening, 2 months later, our doorbell rang during dinner. I opened the door to find a man I didn't recognize standing on our porch. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a work uniform with Novak embroidered on the pocket. My stomach dropped as I realized this was Catherine's father. "Is your son Cade home?" he asked with controlled anger in his voice. I nodded and called Cade to the door. He came slouching over until he saw Mr. Novak. Then his face went pale and he took a step backward. Mr. Novak's voice shook as he spoke. "Your son has been tormenting my daughter for months. She cries every night. She's scared to go to school. She's failing classes because of him." Cade started to protest, but Mr. Novak cut him off. He pulled out his phone and showed us screenshots of messages Cade had sent Catherine on fake social media accounts after being blocked on his real ones. Cruel comments about her appearance, threats to spread rumors, manipulated photos, things I had no idea were happening. I felt my knees go weak as I looked at my son. This went far beyond awkward teenage flirting. This was systematic harassment. Cade tried to grab my arm saying Mr. Novak was lying, but I pulled away from him. The evidence was right there on the phone screen. "I've gone to the police," Mr. Novak said. "They said to document everything and file a restraining order, but I wanted to look him in the eye first." He stepped closer to Cade, who shrank back against the wall. Mr. Novak's hands were clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might actually hit my son. Cade must have thought so too because he started apologizing rapidly, saying he didn't mean it and he was just joking around. "Joking?" Mr. Novak's voice was deadly quiet. "My daughter tried to hurt herself because of your jokes." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I heard myself asking in a shaky voice if Catherine was getting help now. Mr. Novak's jaw tightened, and he told me she was in therapy 3 times a week and taking medication for panic attacks that started after my son's harassment got worse. The weight of what Cade had done crashed over me, and I gripped the doorframe to steady myself while Cade kept trying to say something, but Mr. Novak cut him off with a look that made my son shrink even further against the wall. "Expect legal papers," Mr. Novak said before turning and walking down our porch steps, his shoulders rigid with the effort of not turning back. The moment his truck pulled away, Cade immediately started insisting the man was lying and making things up to get attention, but I wasn't listening anymore as I reached into his pocket and grabbed his phone before he could react. He tried to snatch it back, his hands grabbing at mine, but I held firm even though my hands were shaking and told him to go to his room right now. He stomped up the stairs yelling that I was being crazy and believing lies about him. But I was already sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone with growing horror. The fake accounts he'd created were right there. Usernames like Truth About KN and Messy Jessie Exposed, with messages far worse than what Mr. Novak had shown us. Sexual comments about her body, threats to share edited photos at the school, detailed descriptions of what he wanted to do to her, messages sent at all hours including 3 in the morning. My stomach turned as I screenshotted everything, page after page of cruel messages that showed planning and intent, not just mean jokes. Some messages included photos he'd taken of her at the school without her knowing, zoomed in on her body, edited in disgusting ways. I found group chats where he'd shared these with other boys who laughed and encouraged him to do more. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the phone as I kept finding more evidence in deleted folders he thought were hidden. When I finally looked at the clock, it was past 11, but I called Mrs. Nielsen's home number anyway, leaving a long voicemail about Mr. Novak's visit and everything I'd found on the phone. My voice broke as I admitted I had no idea how bad things really were, and that we needed an emergency meeting about keeping Catherine safe from my son. I sat at that table for another hour going through every app, every folder, every deleted item, building a file of evidence that painted my son as a predator. That night I barely slept, getting up every hour to check that Cade hadn't snuck out or gotten another device from somewhere. I could see light under his door, so I knew he was awake too, probably trying to figure out how to spin this or delete evidence remotely, but we didn't speak, and the silence in our house felt heavy and suffocating. Around 3 in the morning, I heard him go to the bathroom and I immediately checked his room, finding an old tablet under his mattress that I confiscated along with a burner phone I found in his closet. The next morning, Mrs. Nielsen called back at 7 and scheduled us for an immediate meeting with the principal at 9, mentioning they'd need to create a safety plan and would probably need to involve law enforcement beyond what Mr. Novak had already started. I agreed to bring all the evidence I'd found, and she said to print everything if possible so they'd have physical copies for their files. At the school, the principal's face grew more serious with each screenshot, while Cade sat sulking beside me, occasionally muttering that everyone was overreacting, or that Catherine was just trying to get attention. They explained he'd be moved to different classes immediately, would have an escort between periods, and any contact with Catherine, even accidental, would result in immediate suspension pending expulsion. The principal pulled out a map of the school and showed us the routes Cade would take to avoid any possibility of encountering Catherine, including using a different entrance and eating lunch in the guidance office. They assigned specific teachers to watch him during their free periods, and said his locker would be moved to a different wing of the building. After the meeting, I sat in my car and wrote an email to Mr. Novak apologizing and asking if there was anything I could do to help with Catherine's therapy costs, making it clear I wasn't asking for forgiveness or trying to minimize what happened. His response came within an hour, just 2 sentences saying he appreciated the gesture, but they needed us to respect their space completely. Back at the school that afternoon, they assigned Officer Leland Carter, their resource officer, to explain the restraining order process to us in a small conference room. He was direct about potential criminal charges including harassment, cyberstalking, and distribution of manipulated images of a minor, and for the first time Cade looked genuinely scared, as Officer Carter explained that juvenile detention was a real possibility. We left school with a thick packet of requirements including mandatory therapy twice a week, no social media access whatsoever, supervised internet only for homework that had to be done in the living room, and weekly check-ins with the school. Cade complained the whole drive home that everyone was overreacting, and that Catherine was probably laughing about all the attention she was getting. And I pulled over on the side of the road and told him if he said that one more time, I was driving straight to the police station to let them handle him. When we got home, I told Cade to sit in the living room while I went upstairs to his bedroom. I started pulling open drawers and checking under his mattress while he stood in the doorway watching me. Behind some old shoes in his closet, I found a small USB drive taped to the wall. My hands shook as I plugged it into my laptop downstairs. The screen filled with folders labeled with dates going back months. Inside were dozens of photos of Catherine taken without her knowing, screenshots of her social media posts, and worst of all, edited pictures that made me want to throw up. Some had her face pasted onto other bodies, and others had disgusting comments written across them. I called our internet provider right away and asked about parental controls. The technician walked me through installing monitoring software on every device in the house. It would track every website visited, every message sent, and alert me to any attempts to bypass it. Cade stood behind me calling me crazy and saying I was treating him like a prisoner. I ignored him and kept following the technician's instructions to lock down our router and block certain sites. That evening, Mrs. Nielsen sent me an email with links to websites about bullying and harassment. I stayed up until 3 in the morning reading every article and guide. They described warning signs like lack of empathy, blaming victims, and escalating behavior when challenged. Every single one matched what I'd been seeing in Cade for months, but had explained away. The guilt made my chest hurt, but I forced myself to keep reading and taking notes about intervention strategies. 3 days later, we sat in a waiting room at the therapy center the school recommended. Deepika Green came out to get us, a woman in her 40s with a calm voice and firm handshake. She brought us into her office and started asking Cade about his perspective on what happened. He launched into his usual story about Catherine overreacting and everyone misunderstanding him. Deepika didn't argue or interrupt, but when he finished, she asked him to describe how Catherine might have felt. He rolled his eyes and said she probably loved the attention. She redirected him again, asking about the impact of his actions regardless of his intent. He kept trying to deflect, but she stayed focused on consequences, not excuses. By the end of the session, he was sulking, but had at least stopped actively arguing. Word about what happened started spreading through our community. At the grocery store, a woman I recognized from the school events cornered me near the produce section. She said I was destroying my son's future over normal teenage boy behavior. She went on about how girls today were too sensitive and couldn't take a joke anymore. Her voice got louder as she said, I should be supporting my son instead of letting some girl ruin his life. Other shoppers turned to stare as I grabbed my cart and walked away with my hands shaking. The restraining order hearing got scheduled for the following week. Deepika explained during our next session that I'd need to provide all the digital evidence to support it. She said it would be hard to submit things that made Cade look terrible, but protecting Catherine had to come first. I spent hours organizing screenshots, photos, and messages into folders for the lawyer. My stomach turned knowing a judge would see what my son had done, but I kept working. During our second therapy appointment, Deepika brought out printed stories from harassment victims. She had Cade read them out loud one by one. At first, he rolled his eyes and read in a bored voice. But when he got to one about a girl who tried to kill herself after months of harassment, his voice got quieter. The story described panic attacks, failing grades, and feeling trapped with nowhere safe to go. For just a moment, I saw something change in his face before he went back to staring at the wall. The school sent me their safety plan for Catherine the next day. She would leave each class 5 minutes early to avoid hallway encounters. They assigned her a private room for lunch away from the cafeteria. Teachers would stand at specific points between classes to make sure no accidental meetings happened. The principal promised to email me daily, confirming Cade followed all rules and stayed in his assigned areas. Officer Carter called that afternoon with disturbing news. Their tech team had found evidence that Cade had been using VPN software and spoofing apps to hide his online activity. He explained how these tools work to mask internet traffic and create fake phone numbers for texting. The level of planning required to set all this up showed this wasn't some impulsive mistake. Officer Carter taught me what to look for in browser history and how to spot signs of hidden apps. He said if charges got filed, the digital forensics team would do a complete analysis of all our devices. A week later, I got a call from another parent whose son was friends with Cade. She said Cade had used his son's Instagram account to send Catherine a message. The message started as an apology, but quickly turned into blaming her for misunderstanding his intentions and ruining his life. The parent had immediately taken screenshots and blocked Catherine to prevent further contact. I thanked her for telling me and hung up feeling sick. I found Cade in his room and took away his access to our family computer completely. He yelled that I was being unfair, but I walked out without responding. 3 days later, I was at the pharmacy picking up my blood pressure medication when a woman I barely knew from the PTA cornered me by the vitamins. She started telling me loudly how I was ruining Cade's entire future over some girl who couldn't take a joke. Other customers turned to stare as she went on about how kids these days were too sensitive and how boys couldn't even talk to girls anymore without getting in trouble. I grabbed my prescription and walked past her to the register while she kept talking behind me about how I was destroying my own son. My hands shook as I paid, and I made it to my car before the tears started coming. I sat there in the parking lot for 20 minutes trying to pull myself together. That evening, Deepika gave Cade homework to write about the situation from Catherine's perspective to understand victim impact. When I checked what he wrote an hour later, it was just 2 sentences saying she probably felt bad, but should have told him to stop if she didn't like it. I made him sit back down at the kitchen table while I watched him do it properly. He argued for the first hour that this was stupid and wouldn't help anything. The second hour, he kept writing jokes and crossing them out when I made him start over. By the third hour, he finally wrote something about how maybe she felt trapped and scared when he wouldn't leave her alone. It wasn't great, but at least it showed he could imagine her feelings when forced to try. The school disciplinary hearing happened 2 days later in the conference room with 4 teachers present to give testimony. Mrs. Rodriguez described seeing Cade corner Catherine against her locker multiple times when she tried to walk away from him. Mr. Chen talked about Cade following Catherine to her car after school even when she asked him to stop. The gym teacher mentioned Cade making sexual gestures at Catherine during PE class while other boys laughed. The art teacher had witnessed Cade drawing crude pictures of Catherine and passing them around. Each teacher had documented dates and specific incidents that painted a clear pattern of harassment over months. I sat there taking notes and feeling sick as I realized how much had been happening that I never knew about. After the hearing ended, I walked to my car and saw Mr. Novak standing by his truck in the parking lot. He walked over and told me Catherine had panic attacks every morning before school now, and threw up from anxiety most days. He asked if I understood what it was like to watch your child suffer like that every single day. I could only nod and say I was sorry while he talked about how his daughter used to love school, and now she was failing everything. He didn't yell or threaten, but the pain in his voice was worse than anger. When I got home, I started organizing all the paperwork for our lawyer and found Cade's old middle school yearbook in a box. I opened it and saw comments he'd written next to classmates' pictures calling them ugly or stupid or fat. One girl had, "Nobody likes you," written next to her photo in Cade's handwriting. Another had, "Kill yourself," scribbled by her name. The pattern went back at least 3 years, and I'd never even looked at these yearbooks before. I sat on the floor of his room realizing I'd been making excuses for this behavior much longer than I wanted to admit. My ex-husband called that night saying I was overreacting, and that boys will be boys. And this was all normal teenage stuff. I emailed him screenshots of everything, including the messages to Catherine and the yearbook pages. He didn't respond for a whole day, and then sent a short text saying I should handle it however I thought was best. No offer to help or come talk to Cade or anything else. Officer Carter came by the next afternoon to explain that parents could be held legally responsible if they didn't properly supervise a child who was under a restraining order. He gave me a printed list of specific requirements about monitoring and documenting everything. I had to keep a log of where Cade was every hour, and make sure he had no unsupervised internet access and couldn't go anywhere Catherine might be. The officer explained that if Cade violated the order and I hadn't been supervising properly, I could face charges myself. The legal responsibility scared me, but also made me more determined to follow every rule exactly. Deepika scheduled a parent-only session with me to create a structured consequence system for home. She explained that every single privilege had to be earned through demonstrating real empathy and taking responsibility for his actions. No TV or games or friend time unless he completed therapy assignments properly and showed genuine understanding of harm caused. She warned me this wasn't going to be a quick fix and could take years of consistent enforcement before seeing real change. When I got home and told Cade about the new internet restrictions, he lost it completely and punched a hole in his bedroom wall. I immediately called the non-emergency police number like Officer Carter had instructed. An officer arrived within 30 minutes and gave Cade a formal warning about property damage while explaining that any more violence would result in arrest. Cade looked shocked that I'd actually called the police on him for punching a wall. The next morning, our lawyer forwarded an email from Mr. Novak's attorney saying they would submit written testimony instead of making Catherine testify in court. The attached affidavit described her self-harm attempt in detail, including the method she tried and how her parents found her. I only made it halfway through before I had to run to the bathroom and throw up. After cleaning myself up in the bathroom, I sat at my desk and started writing a letter to the Novak family, my hands still shaking as I typed each word. The victim advocate Ayana Webb had contacted me earlier that week saying she could pass along any communication if the family was willing to receive it. I rewrote the letter 6 times, deleting sentences that sounded like excuses or requests for forgiveness. The final version just acknowledged the harm Cade caused and promised I would do everything possible to prevent it from happening again. Ayana called me the next day and thanked me for not making the letter about my own pain or asking for responses the family wasn't ready to give. She emailed me a document about accountability that explained how contacting victims could re-traumatize them even with good intentions. The guidelines made it clear that Catherine might never want any contact with us, and that was her right, not something to push against or try to change through repeated apologies. The focus had to stay on changing Cade's behavior, not on getting forgiveness to make ourselves feel better. While gathering financial documents for our lawyer, I started going through old bank statements and credit card bills looking for anything relevant to the case. That's when I found charges from 3 different apps designed to edit and manipulate photos, with purchases going back 4 months before Mr. Novak showed up at our door. The dates proved this wasn't some sudden mean streak or misunderstood joke, but planned harassment that Cade had been preparing for. I printed everything and drove straight to the lawyer's office, watching him flip through the pages with a grim expression as he added them to our file for the restraining order hearing. 2 weeks later, we sat in the courtroom while the judge reviewed the thick folder of evidence, including the screenshots, the bank records, and statements from teachers and other students. Cade's lawyer tried arguing for lesser restrictions, saying a full restraining order would disrupt his education and social development, but the judge cut him off mid-sentence. She looked directly at Cade and told him any violation would result in immediate arrest, no warnings or second chances. The order was set for 1 year with possibility of extension, if there were any concerning behaviors. Walking out of the courthouse, I got a call from the principal saying the school was recommending Cade transfer to their alternative education program on the other side of town. The program had more structure with smaller classes and constant supervision, but it also meant admitting my son needed that level of intervention. I drove to the school that afternoon and signed the transfer papers, knowing it was necessary even though it felt like giving up on him returning to normal high school life. During his next therapy session, Deepika had prepared something different from their usual discussions. She handed Cade a printed letter that combined experiences from multiple harassment victims, not just Catherine but others who had gone through similar torment. He started reading it with his usual dismissive attitude, but gradually went quiet, his face losing color as he read description after description of fear, anxiety, and lasting trauma. When he finished, he didn't argue or deflect like usual, but just sat there staring at the paper for several minutes. The silence felt different from his normal sulking, like something might actually be sinking in. Through another email from Ayana, I learned the real cost of what Cade had done to the Novak family beyond just emotional damage. They were paying over $300 per week for Catherine's therapy sessions, had to adjust both their work schedules to drive her to appointments, and lost income from the days they had to leave early or miss entirely. Understanding these concrete impacts on their daily life and finances made me pull money from our savings to send what I could toward those costs, even though I knew money couldn't undo the damage. My boss was understanding when I explained I needed to switch to part-time hours to properly supervise Cade after school, since leaving him alone was no longer safe. The income loss meant canceling our cable, dropping unnecessary subscriptions, and cutting back on everything non-essential, but the alternative was risking him finding ways around the monitoring systems we had in place. A week after the restraining order was publicized in the school communications, anonymous messages started appearing on local Facebook groups defending Cade and calling Catherine dramatic and attention-seeking. I took screenshots of every post and comment, forwarding them to Officer Carter, who said he'd investigate the IP addresses. Within days, he called back saying several traced to phones belonging to Cade's friend group, showing this wasn't just my son's problem, but a wider cultural issue among these boys. Those same friends stopped coming to our house once their parents learned about the restraining order and what Cade had actually done. His bedroom door stayed open as required by our new rules, and I could see him lying on his bed most afternoons just staring at the ceiling. Part of me felt sad watching him isolated from everyone, but I also recognized this might be the only way he'd finally understand the seriousness of his actions without his friends reinforcing his victim mentality. The new rules started that same week with a printed schedule taped to Cade's bedroom door, listing every 15-minute block from wake up to bedtime. He had to initial each time slot showing what he did, and his door stayed open except when changing clothes. I installed monitoring software on every device in the house. Even the smart TV and the router logged all internet activity with screenshots every 30 seconds. Cade complained constantly about living in a prison, but I reminded him the judge had mentioned actual juvenile detention as a possibility if we couldn't maintain proper supervision at home. The first few days he tested every boundary, closing his door repeatedly until I removed it from the hinges entirely and stored it in the garage. He tried using the bathroom for privacy, but I set a 5-minute timer whenever he went in, knocking if he stayed longer. By the end of the week, he stopped fighting the structure and just followed the schedule with sullen compliance. The next week, something shifted when he did his assigned chores without me asking, taking out trash and loading the dishwasher every evening for 7 straight days. He still wouldn't talk about what he'd done to Catherine, but Deepika called this progress, explaining that compliance comes before comprehension in cases like this. 3 weeks later, I stood at the podium during the school board meeting with my prepared notes shaking in my hands. Without naming anyone specific, I described how harassment had escalated unchecked in their schools and urged them to implement stronger prevention programs with real consequences. Some parents in the audience nodded and clapped when I finished, but others glared at me with obvious disgust, whispering to each other about overreacting mothers ruining kids' lives. The juvenile court date arrived 2 months after the restraining order, with Cade wearing the only suit he owned, too small in the shoulders now. The prosecutor read the charges while we stood before the judge, and our lawyer negotiated the plea deal they'd worked out beforehand. 2 years probation with weekly check-ins, 200 hours of community service at a domestic violence shelter, mandatory therapy twice weekly with progress reports to the court, and restitution payments for Catherine's therapy costs from any money Cade earned until he turned 18. The judge asked Cade if he understood and accepted these terms, and he said yes in a voice so quiet, she made him repeat it louder. For his first reflection essay assignment from Deepika, Cade sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours, writing and crossing out sentences while I supervised from across the room. Most of it sounded like what he thought she wanted to hear, talking about learning and growing, but near the end he wrote one sentence that made me pause. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. Not a full admission of everything he'd done, but the first time he'd acknowledged causing harm without adding excuses or explanations. The paperwork for the alternative school transfer came through the following week, finalizing his placement for the next semester starting in January. The building sat 40 minutes away with metal detectors at every entrance, security guards in the hallways, and cameras in every classroom. More importantly, Catherine would never have to worry about running into him since the schools were in completely different districts. Through another email from Ayana, I learned that Catherine's panic attacks had decreased from happening every single day to about once a week since the restraining order went into effect. She still couldn't return to regular school, doing all her classes online from home, and her parents remained unwilling to accept any form of apology from us, which I completely understood given everything she'd endured. After 2 months of following every rule without complaint, I decided to give Cade limited phone access, 1 hour each evening with full monitoring through an app that recorded everything. The very first night he tried to stay on for an extra 20 minutes, claiming he didn't hear the timer, so I took the phone away for 3 days. When he got it back, he watched the clock carefully and handed it over at exactly 60 minutes, learning slowly that trust gets earned in tiny drops but lost in buckets. The parent support group met every Tuesday evening in the basement of a church downtown, about 15 people sitting in a circle sharing stories about their struggling children. Some had kids with drug problems, others with violence issues, and several dealing with harassment cases like mine. Listening to their experiences helped me feel less alone, though I noticed some parents still making the same excuses I used to make, blaming schools or other kids instead of accepting their child's responsibility. The facilitator, a woman whose own son was serving time for assault, kept reminding us that holding our children accountable wasn't the opposite of loving them, but actually the strongest form of love we could show. The local news broke a story about multiple boys at Cade's school having a group chat where they shared photos of female classmates without consent, rating their bodies and making sexual comments. The investigation expanded beyond just Cade to include 12 other students, and while it didn't excuse his targeted harassment of Catherine, it helped explain how this behavior had been normalized and encouraged among his peer group. I printed out every screenshot I could find from the group chat and brought them to the principal's office the next morning. The secretary told me to wait, but I pushed past her desk and walked straight into the meeting room where the principal sat with 2 other administrators reviewing files. They looked up startled as I dropped the stack of papers on the conference table and started spreading them out, pointing to messages from 12 different boys making comments about girls' bodies and sharing photos taken without permission. The principal picked up page after page while I explained how this went beyond just Cade and showed a pattern of harassment throughout the entire grade. Within an hour, they'd called in Officer Carter, who started documenting everything for a broader investigation. 3 days later, my phone started ringing non-stop with angry parents demanding to know why I'd involved their sons in Cade's mess. One mother cornered me at the grocery store and accused me of trying to spread the blame to make Cade look better. I told her all our kids needed help before another girl ended up like Catherine, but she stormed off calling me names. That evening, Cade found out from a friend's text that I'd given the school evidence about the group chat. He came charging down the stairs screaming that I was betraying him and ruining his friendships. His face turned red as he yelled about how I was supposed to be on his side, and now everyone hated him even more. I grabbed my keys and purse while he followed me to the door still shouting. When I actually got in the car and started backing out of the driveway, his expression changed from anger to shock. He stood in the doorway staring as I drove away, and parked at a coffee shop 3 blocks away to wait until he calmed down. 6 months passed with Cade following his probation requirements and attending therapy twice weekly. I was shopping for groceries at the mall when I turned a corner and saw Catherine with her mother looking at clothes in a store window. Our eyes met for just a second before I immediately turned around and walked quickly toward the opposite exit. My hands shook as I left through the parking garage instead of the main entrance where I'd parked. Cade had started working at a fast food place after school, and every 2 weeks his paycheck got deposited into an account I controlled. The first payment of $300 went straight to the restitution fund for Catherine's therapy costs. Cade complained bitterly about working 20 hours just to pay for someone else's treatment, but I reminded him that treatment wouldn't exist without his actions. Every payment slip I signed felt like a small step toward accountability. During a probation check at the courthouse, I walked down the hallway carrying Cade's attendance records when Mr. Novak came around the corner from the elevator. We both stopped for a moment and he gave me a brief nod before continuing past. It wasn't forgiveness or friendship, but it was acknowledgement that I was trying to do the right thing now. That small gesture meant more to me than he could possibly know. Deepika reduced our sessions to monthly check-ins after Cade maintained stable behavior for several weeks straight. She warned me during our last weekly appointment that he was contained through external structure, not genuinely changed inside. The rules and monitoring might need to stay in place permanently to keep others safe from harm. I accepted this reality and started planning for long-term management instead of hoping for transformation. Our house operated like a boarding school now, with printed schedules taped to the refrigerator showing homework time from 4 to 6, dinner at 6:30, and supervised recreation until 8. Cade's bedroom door stayed open during study time, and I did random checks to make sure he was actually working. His phone stayed locked in my room except for his monitored hour each evening. He followed the rules without much complaint anymore, though I never saw real remorse in his eyes when Catherine's name came up. Deepika called it compliance without comprehension, and said it was better than active harm even if it wasn't ideal. I'm writing this story now as a warning to other parents who might see their own excuses reflected in mine. My son terrorized an innocent girl while I made justifications about him not understanding social cues and just needing friends. Now Catherine needs years of therapy, can't attend regular school, and has panic attacks because I didn't want to believe my child could be cruel. Cade lives under constant supervision that might never end because I chose comfortable denial over difficult truth. Love doesn't mean protecting your child from consequences or making excuses for harmful behavior. Real love means setting firm boundaries even when it's painful, getting them help even when they resist, and accepting responsibility for the damage done even when it's too late to fix it. Every parent wants to believe their child is good at heart, but sometimes love means admitting they're not, and doing whatever it takes to keep others safe from them. That's it for today's story. Thanks for letting me share it with you. I really do hope it brightened your day even a little. Stick around by subscribing and we'll do it again soon.